Yeah, so my name is Markus Gehrsitz. I'm a reader in economics at the University of Strathclyde. And as you can tell from the title of this presentation, I want to share results from a project on the effect of post-release supervision of offenders on reoffending. Before we jump into it, just a couple of disclaimers. So this work was supported by ADR UK by way of a fellowship to me. We are using data from the Ministry of Justice through the ONS Secure Research Service. And I want to mention that some of the statistics you're going to see today are not necessarily one-to-one equivalent to statistics provided by MOJ. We're using slightly different definitions, but I'll talk about that more once we get into the details here. I just want to start out with providing some background on the criminal justice system in the UK. This is probably the first chart we produced for the project, and it shows that reoffending is a really serious issue, especially reoffending of offenders released from short custodial sentences. So if you focus on the blue top line here, what this chart is showing you is that something like 50% of offenders released from short custodial sentences reoffend within 26 weeks, so within half a year. And at the 1 year mark, we're sitting at almost 2/3, so extremely high reoffending rates. And naturally, reoffending and crime are associated with quite substantial socioeconomic costs. And a natural follow-up question is then, what could we do to reduce this kind of reoffending? And a candidate policy or potential policy to mitigate that issue could be supervision and license conditions. So in this project, we asked, well, do they work? Do supervision and license conditions upon release from prison reduce reoffending? And this may sound like a simple question, but turns out to be extremely tricky to answer because supervision is, of course, not randomly assigned to offenders, but typically the most high-risk offenders are more likely to be supervised, are receiving more intensive supervision. And so what you often find is this kind of spurious correlation between supervision and reoffending. Now, that doesn't mean that supervision causes reoffending, not at all. It's just an artifact of that kind of selection issue. And so what is really interesting about our project is that we combine admin data with a quasi-experimental setting that breaks that selection issue. And so specifically what we're doing is we're exploiting a natural experiment created by the 2014 Offender Rehabilitation Act to kind of figure out whether supervision actually has a causal effect on reoffending. In a nutshell, what the Offender Rehabilitation Act, and I'll call it ORA throughout the presentation, did is randomly assign some offenders to supervised release and others to be released unconditionally. And I won't get too much into the full legislation at this point. We can talk about it later on, but this is kind of the key feature. And the kind of key institutional detail here is that ORA introduced supervision for offenders released from prison spells of less than 12 months, but only for those who had committed an offense on or after February 1st, 2015. And so you can kind of see how this creates a really, for a researcher, useful setting where this reform essentially created two groups: a treatment group, which is everyone who committed an offense on February 1st or just thereafter. These offenders will get released with 1 year of supervision and license conditions in place, and we'll compare them to a control group of individuals who committed the same type of offense, but they happen to have committed it on January 31st or January 30th of 2015. And so the idea is that those two groups will be identical in pretty much every respect, except for the fact that the treatment group well, they received the treatment, they received supervision and license conditions. And so from that kind of comparison, which kind of resembles this randomized controlled trial that we'd ideally want to run, from that kind of comparisons, we can recover the actual effect of supervision on reoffending. When you look at the data, you can clearly see the aura effect too, right? So the idea, just to really bring this across, is we're going to compare everyone over here. These are folk who committed an offense just after February 1st, and you can see virtually all of them are released with supervision in place. We're going to compare that group to everyone down here who was going to be a control group, and they just happen to be released unsupervised because their offense predated, just about predated February 1st, 2015. And so that's the kind of comparison that we're going to make, and I'll try to convince you throughout that talk that this is really an apples to apples comparison and that these two groups are pretty much identical. And I think they really are. Again, just to provide a little bit of background on the supervision structure and the institutional setting. So pre-ORA, if somebody committed an offense, let's say they committed an offense right around this time, let's say the 31st of January 2015, they commit an offense, the case goes to court, eventually they're sentenced. They start a prison spell, let's say it's a 6-month prison sentence, you get released at the halfway point of your sentence. So after 3 months, they get released. That's it. Unconditional release, no strings attached. And we're going to compare that to someone who committed an offense at just about the same time, February 1st, 2015, let's say. Same kind of structure. They go to court, ultimately they're sentenced, they go to prison, 6-month prison sentence. They're released at the halfway point after 3 months, and then they get 1 year of supervision thereafter. And an important feature of that supervision is that it is split into 2 sub-periods, the so-called license period and the post-sentence supervision period. Without going into too much detail, you can think about them as more intensive and slightly less intensive periods. So the license period is slightly more intensive. You have more frequent interactions with your probation officers, less so in the PSS. And a key feature of the license period is also that you can be recalled to prison, typically for 14 days, if you violate your license conditions. So let's say one of your license conditions is that you have to take frequent drug tests. You fail a drug test, your probation officer can recall you to prison for 14 days. The length of these sub-periods depends on the original sentence. So the license period stretches across the remainder of the sentence. So somebody who is sentenced to 6 months in prison, gets released after 3 months, they will be on license for the remaining 3 months of their sentence. And then they'll be under the PSS regime for the remaining 9 months, such that license period and PSS add up to 1 year. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of the institutional setting that we're in. And I'll get back to this feature of recalls as we go along in the presentation. Let me quickly talk about the data that we used. So we had access, again, via the ONS SRS through the cross-justice system datasets provided by the Ministry of Justice. In essence, this is the universe of magistrates' courts cases and Crown Courts cases up until March 2023. And we're able to kind of link across those. So if we have a defendant that shows up in multiple cases, we can identify that. And more crucially, we can link that to a prison data set as well, where we can see basically an offender who shows up in a, let's say, a magistrate's courts, gets sentenced, when do they start their prison spell, and when do they get released. We can also link in information from the probation data set, which contains information on license conditions that were attached to that. So in a nutshell, what this really rich and really unique data allows us to do is to construct very detailed offender journeys, right? We have the date of offense. Remember, that determines whether you end up in our treatment group or our control group. We have that from the court data. We have the date of release from prison. That's really important because that's when the kind of reoffending time window starts. And by linking back into the courts, we can get measures of reoffending, reconviction, and reincarceration by going back into the prison data as well. And here's kind of where our definition of reoffending is slightly different from the Ministry of Justice's definition that they typically use. In our study, and this is very common in the academic literature, we define reoffending as an offense that results in a reconviction by a court, either magistrates or Crown Court. We do not count cautions, for instance, as reoffending, right? So that's something to bear in mind. Okay, this is the slide for the econometricians and statistics geeks among you. We are using a local randomization regression discontinuity design to analyze this kind of natural experiment. The intuition, I think, is quite easy. We treat observations around this February 1st cutoff as if they were generated from a randomized controlled trial. If you happen to land on the February side of the cutoff, you're in a treatment group. If you happen to land on the January side of the cutoff, you're in the control group. And the kind of idea here is that these two types of groups should be all but identical in terms of their underlying propensity to reoffend. And I'll show you some evidence that this is indeed the case. So what this table is showing you is a comparison of a treatment group, a post-ORA group, and a control group. And I'm going to focus on a time window of 113 days around this February 1st cutoff. That's the kind of bandwidth that our algorithm suggests is ideal, but everything kind of holds for much shorter or much longer windows as well. And what you can see is that these two groups are all but identical. So if you focus, for example, here on the share British, share white in our treatment group, that's 90 and 85% respectively. In a control group, exactly the same share. Age distribution in our treatment group, pretty much identical to the age distribution in our control group. Number of previous offenses, 16.22 in a treatment group, a supervised group, 16.26 in our control group, in our comparison group. So pretty much identical, exactly as you would expect if whether you go into the treatment or control group is essentially randomly determined. You can maybe even more convincingly see that if you plot the data as well. So this here is the average age at release from prison. And remember, what we're going to do ultimately is compare this group here, our treatment group, everybody who committed their offense just after that February 1st cutoff. We're going to compare them to this group here, a control group. And you can see in terms of age, these two groups are identical. Nothing kind of changes at that cutoff date in a discontinuous way. So it's truly an apples to apples comparison. You might be concerned, maybe courts are aware of the legislation and that they change their sentencing behavior. Doesn't seem to be happening either, right? The average prison sentence length for a treatment group over here is identical to that of our control group. So no differences there either. If you look at criminal histories, so this is one example, number of previous, share of prisoners who have no previous incarcerations. Again, no difference whatsoever. And I could show you, 10 more of these charts, but the bottom line here is our treatment and control group, they are identical in all observable measures. So what that means is the one difference that we have between those two groups is, well, the treatment group is supervised upon release. So the big question is, what happens if we stick a reoffending outcome on the y-axis of these charts? Any difference we see there, we can plausibly attribute that to supervision and license conditions. And lo and behold, when we do that, indeed, there's a clear-cut jump. So remember, this here is a treated group. These are the guys who are supervised. And this here is our control group. And our treated group has clearly lower reoffending rates than our control group. So that means supervision lowered reoffending. What we're looking at here is just a 4-week follow-up period. So within 4 weeks of release, supervised offenders are 9% less likely to reoffend. You can also look at that at the intensive margin, so with the number of reoffenses within 4 weeks. And again, it's the same picture, right? There's clearly a drop-off right around where we cross over into our treatment group. So this suggests that really supervision and license conditions reduced reoffending quite substantially. Now you might be saying, well, that's 4 weeks. We are much more interested in kind of more long-run effects, right? What about, half a year, 1 year, when we have these really even higher reoffending rates? Well, here's 52 weeks for you, right? So 52 weeks after release, we still have a clear drop-off, right? We still have this drop here where our supervised treatment group commits on average 8% fewer offenses than our unsupervised control group. And again, I could show you, you might say, well, what about 2 years? What about half a year and so on? So we could create lots and lots of these charts. So rather than walking you through 10 more of these, I've kind of compiled the effect sizes into a single chart that plots the effect size by week since prison release. So I showed you 4 weeks earlier, so this would be something like here. I showed you 52 weeks earlier, that would be here. And so two things are kind of striking here. For one, we have these really large short-run effects. So in the short run, supervision reduces reoffending by a lot. These are the largest, by far the largest effects. But, and I think this is even more interesting, we have this long persistence as well. So even we're kind of at the 3-year mark, 3 years after release, we see that the supervised group is something like 2.5% less likely to have reoffended, right? Even though, remember, supervision is for 1 year. Supervision ends here. 2 years after that, we still have that lower reoffending rate. And so that kind of tells us there is really a persistent effect. There's really some sort of behavioral change happening that's induced by supervision. So to quickly recap, we set out with what I think is a super interesting question. Does supervision and license conditions, do they reduce reoffending? And we think we have a convincing answer to that question. They do. And hopefully this kind of somewhat showcases how powerful this combination of using quasi-experimental data on rich admin data can be. It allows us to kind of get at these questions where we really need a causal answer, where a correlation isn't good enough. But our answer to this question also raises a couple of follow-up questions, namely, why does it work? Or what's the mechanism that's driving our results? And then you might also be very interested in, well, who does it work for? Are there differences across offenders, for example? And so I'll give you the kind of quick version, the quick answer to both of these questions to the extent that we can. Let's start with subgroup analysis. So who does it work for? What you see here is, again, the effect sizes for 3 follow-up time windows, 4 weeks, 26 weeks, 52 weeks. After 52 weeks, nothing much changes. So this is going to be identical to 104, 156 weeks. And a couple of things stand out. So first of all, if you look at demographic characteristics, classic social science question, there's not really much of a difference, right? Age doesn't really seem to matter. Ethnicity doesn't really seem to matter. British nationals have about the same effect as non-British nationals. Not much going on there. Where you really see effect heterogeneity is in two ways. First, right here, you can see that the effect is in a way driven by individuals who are serving their very first prison spell, whereas folks who had 5 or more previous prison spells show essentially no reaction to supervision. So first timers are really what's driving that. And second, you see pretty pronounced differences too by sentence length, where individuals released from longer sentences, 6 to 12-month sentences, show a large effect, and we don't see much for anyone on a really short prison sentence. And remember, the sentence length determines the length of your license period, of your kind of period of intensive supervision. And so it looks like people who get a longer intensive supervision period, they show the largest reaction to supervision as well in terms of reducing their reoffending. You can see that graphically as well. So this is everyone. This is kind of our trajectory chart for everyone who was originally sentenced to less than 2 months. And you can see this is a zero effect basically throughout. In the short run and the long run, no reaction to supervision by this group. So, short license period essentially corresponds with a zero effect. This is now 3 to 5 month sentences. And this is kind of our usual picture, right? These kind of pronounced short run effects and this persistent long run effect. The long run effect is kind of borderline statistically significant. So you can kind of see up here, for example, the confidence interval touches 0. But it looks like this group is reacting to supervision, broadly speaking. And then the biggest effects, that's our 6 to 12 month group, right? The scale, if you watch the scale, is larger here. So you have these really large short run effects, and then this clearly large and persistent long run effects of supervision on reducing reoffending. So our first kind of takeaway in terms of mechanism is it looks like more intensive supervision also leads to lower reoffending. So the intensity of supervision matters. Remember, a second subgroup where we saw a lot of action was first-time prisoners. And you can see clearly this kind of general trajectory of a large short-run effect and a persistent and reasonably sized long-run effect is there for them. So that's what's driving our results. Whereas if you look at our repeatedly incarcerated group, so these are people who had up to 5 prison spells or more before their current prison spell. In the long run, it doesn't really seem to matter. I mean, at least, it looks like the 0 is within our confidence band. So if anything, the effects in the long run are much smaller. We still get somewhat sizable short run effects for our kind of habitual offenders, if you want to think about it that way. And what's striking is that kind of these short run effects up until right here, they occur very early. And this early period is probably also the period when prison recalls can still happen. So if you were to see that a large share of this population is recalled to prison, is in a way incapacitated during those early weeks, then that plausibly explain these really sizable short-run effects. And so we looked at that, and again, this is pretty much exactly what we find. So if you focus in this chart, which is showing you the share of the treatment group that is incapacitated, that is in prison because of a prison recall, and you focus on the dashed line, sorry, the dotted line, I should say, you can see something like 6.5% of our habitual offenders are back in prison, 14 days after their initial release because of a recall. And essentially, the share of this group that is incapacitated peaks just around the time, 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, up to 5 weeks maybe, where we also see the largest reductions in reoffending, where we see the largest treatment effects, so to speak. However, if you focus on the dashed line, so that's our first-time prisoners, they're not recalled at a particularly high rate. So even though we see even larger short-run effects for this group, it looks like recalls are not driving it for them. It looks like here we have a genuine kind of behavioral change. When it comes to the long run, obviously it has to be genuine behavioral change, right? So again, this is first-time prisoners. For them, the long-run effects, they can't be explained by prison recalls, right? At most, you can get recalled until week 26. For most people, the recall window is much, much shorter than that. And even these kind of large short-run effects, for first-timers, they're not recalled at a particularly high rate. So recalls are not explaining that for them either. They do, most likely for more prolific offenders, but for first-time prisoners, they seem to react by somehow changing their behavior. So it seems for them, supervision really results in kind of a genuine behavioral change, not just some sort of incapacitation that kind of takes them out of the population of potential offenders for a short time. Okay, so I'll start concluding here. I think a couple of takeaways. Again, I want to emphasize that this is probably one of the first studies that combines administrative data with quasi-experimental methods in the UK. It helps us to provide causal evidence on what works, and that's, we think, quite a nice showcasing of how powerful this combination of quasi-experimental methods and admin data is. So that's one contribution of the study in a broader sense. More specifically, we're showing that supervision and license conditions are quite effective at reducing reoffending, in particular in the short run. Although in the short run, we have to distinguish between our kind of repeatedly incarcerated prisoners. For them, it seems to be mostly recalls and incapacitation that is doing the work. But for first-time prisoners, we have genuine behavioral change happening, both in the short run and in the long run. So these kind of moderate, but still in a way quite sizable reductions in long-run reoffending are worth emphasizing. There's all kinds of policy implications. Just two of the most obvious ones here are that if we have limited resources, we should probably target them towards first-time prisoners. They show the largest responses to them. They seem to generally change their behavior, so that's a good population to target. And if you think back, there's also evidence suggesting that more intensive supervision is also more effective. So more helps more in a way. Right, and I'll leave it with that. Thank you very much to listening to this talk. Comments are more than welcome, and happy to take any questions you might have now. If you think of a question later on, please feel free to email me. My email is on this kind of final slide. Thank you very much.